This is Michael Osterlink, and I'm speaking with Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer with the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. He's also the author of Spycraft and Special Ops on the Front Lines of Afghanistan and the Path to Victory, Operation Dark Heart. How you doing, Tony?
Good, how are you?
Good. One of the things that you and I have been working on recently is organizing the center-right in support of rational cuts to the Pentagon budget.
Right.
It's very important, very timely, especially in the light of $16 trillion in debt. Tell us about your interest in this issue and why it's so important.
I think in so many ways we have over-invested in defense, and let me be clear on what I mean by that. First, the authorized use of military force created right after 9/11 has allowed the Pentagon to actually have essentially a bottomless pit, if you will, of money. And what that has allowed the Defense Department to do is actually become essentially a steroid-bound, muscular giant that has far more muscles than brains to use them. So one of the criticisms I've had, and others who from the general officer level have had for years, is that we don't have a cohesive global strategy that we need to design and then design a budget around it. So in essence, we have continued to expand this defensive capability globally without a clear idea of what we're trying to achieve globally. One of the biggest criticisms I have is the fact that we are using an infrastructure that's been modified a couple of times by things like Goldwater Nichols, but fundamentally is still based on the Defense Act of 1947. Are you kidding me? 1947, I mean, think about what the world was like then versus what it's like today. And the threats then are not remotely like today. So what we have to do is understand what is necessary to adapt for in the 21st century. We have to, I think, structure along that line and then invest along that line, not continue to build on the layers of the Cold War infrastructure, which clearly is not only outmoded, I would argue is counterproductive.
So we have institutional and structures from 1947, slight modifications. Then you might add on top of that kind of the 9/11 global war on terror.
Right.
Now, if we are obviously beyond the Cold War and we're kind of rethinking our counterterrorism strategy,
Right.
What are some of the threats then that we now face or will face in the very near future that we should organize our defenses around?
It's very clear that the globe of the 21st century is one which we have huge numbers of individuals, people, populations, countries now growing. Within the context of that growth, we have to understand both their political systems and the motivations of their leaders within those political systems. One of the things that we do at Center for Advanced Defense Studies is intent-based analysis. That is to say, you could have a nuclear weapons arsenal, but it doesn't mean you're going to use it against someone. The French have nuclear weapons. I just don't think they're going to use them against us anytime soon. With that said, we have to understand at a deeper level what the threats actually are and how to posture ourselves to deal with that. There are three areas of concern we have to deal with immediately. First, cyber. What goes without saying. We have allowed an adversary in the form of the Chinese, to be very blunt here, to develop capabilities which we don't fully understand. And yet we have everything we do today in some form crossing upon, touching the internet. So the idea that we don't have a clear policy and strategy beyond, this large monstrosity they've created called Cyber Command is something that needs to concern every citizen. So cyber is one area. Secondly, I think we have to look at energy and natural resources as the real nexus of the next Cold War. Let me be very clear on this. We have a number of competitors on the global market, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Indians, the Europeans at all, the Russians, all dealing with populations, with economies which must grow, which must be sustained. And yet, by all accounts, we have limited energy. So there's going to be a crunch point. And we have to understand that understanding that situation is going to be critical and key to being successful in navigating those straits for the American people in the 21st century. The last area, I think, is one a bit more difficult to understand, but I think if you think about it, you'll understand the logic in it, is investment in real science. One of the things that we did during the Cold War is actually invest in something called the space program. People don't understand how much good technology came out of the lunar landing projects, the space program. And to me, it's appalling that we have neglected our continued development of technology to actually explore the solar system. I'm one of those who do believe that we need to look at natural resources beyond our planet. As I just mentioned, I think we're going to have a Cold War based on this. The solar system is full of a lot of things that we need, and the idea that science fiction of landing on Mars is somehow unobtainable is, to me, insane. We need to be looking at this if we're going to survive as a species. So this is another area of investment. If you think about the amount of money spent on the Cold War, on weapons of mass destruction, on technology relating to thermonuclear weapons, and had we invested that instead on exploring the moon, exploring the solar system, we would be much further ahead as a people, and frankly more focused outwardly on how to develop and expand rather than inwardly on our differences, which tend to create conflict.
So you've laid out some of the threats, some of the areas we should spend some of our resources on developing. With those two things in mind, do you think we need a Pentagon budget that's over $550 billion a year?
Well, frankly, the Pentagon budget is based on layering of corporate interests rather than layering in defense. I think one of the grand ironies, just to take a microcosm of abusive spending, has been Afghanistan. I've talked to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who lament the fact that they're told by loyal Americans who've taken an oath of office that they can't spend all the money they're being sent over to Afghanistan. To me, that's pure insanity. And beyond that, when you talk about spending, much of that money is not actually spent in Afghanistan. It's spent right here in Washington, D.C. on corporate interests. My good friend Jerry Doyle calls it combat to commerce, where actually the money is in the treatment, not the cure of any given defense issue. So this is where we have to be smarter. We have to actually limit ourselves to the things which we must do to defend the country and keep it strong, rather than what we want to do. And this is something else I think we should look at World War II for. We were able to actually sustain a very broad military operation globally for a set amount of time, and then come out of it and refocus on real threats in the Defense Act of 1947. As you pointed out earlier in the interview, we've passed the Cold War. We've passed essentially the largest part of the war on terror. It's time that we actually rethink our strategy, based it on real threats, and then design our budget around those real threats, rather than the continuation of this obtuse, often totally unattached spending that may give great opportunities for people in Pennsylvania and Washington State with Boeing and these other large corporate entities, but really in the long term do not serve the interests of the American people.
Now, I know you oppose sequestration.
I do.
And I know there's a lot of folks across the political spectrum, but all conservatives, who find that the whole process that led to sequestration, it just shows the lack of statesmanship, that politics plays more of a role than people actually taking really tough decisions. But so as a process, it was poorly done. The end results are not good. But it seems to me that the $50 billion that will be cut starting January each year for the next 10 years, it will take us back to 2006 or 7 levels of spending, aren't a big threat to our national security. The amount of money, now the way it's done, because it's across the board, is the problem, I think.
I agree.
But do you think cutting $50 billion each year for 10 years is throwing us over the cliff that you hear from some of these members of Congress?
No, I think as you mentioned, it's the manner of which the law requires them to cut across the board. It's not the issue of cuts. I think you can find a lot of waste immediately if you look really hard. There's two problems with the process. First, the super committee, as far as I'm concerned, I agree with both Rand Paul and Ron Paul, there is no constitutional basis for the super committee. Secondly, it was badly designed by the fact you had people on that committee who had dual loyalties. That is to say, people like Pat Toomey and Patty Murray were going to have to make very difficult decisions, some of which may have gone against their own constituency, which they should never have been put in that position to begin with. So obviously, if you're faced with going back and facing your electorate for some decision you make which hurts them, it's not going to bode well for you. Therefore, you're probably not going to do the right thing. With that said, sequestration, I think, was a bad idea by the fact that even in the time they did have to implement it, they didn't actually back off and say, okay, DOD, go tell us what you can take cuts in, rather than accept the fact you're going to have to take cuts across the board. So I think it's the manner in which the law was presented to the DOD actually created the circumstance for its own demise, which now I think everybody recognizes it has to stop. With that said, There are three areas of focus we must focus on regarding what we can do and already know. First off, special operations. Despite the fact that individual operations and within the context of Special Operations Command, things may not be cheap, they are much cheaper than a larger standing conventional force, period. So we've got to look at how we can use special operations. If dare I say, the old OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, done during World War II, was probably a very good manner to look at. Secondly, cyberspace. Cyber issues which relate to how we do business on a global level. We have to understand not only how cyberspace functions, but what we need to do militarily to protect it and to use it as a method of how do I say this without getting into anything classified, how we use cyberspace in such a way to actually support the defense of our nation using cyberspace as essentially a form of weaponization of cyberspace. Third, and I think most important in many ways, is how do we then use conventional forces in a useful way to secure lines of communication, lines of commerce. Representative Ron Paul and I debated upon this last year when he started running for president. He and I disagree on this point. I do believe that we are obligated as a nation who have helped secure these lines of communication for the free world to continue that. So therefore, I think we must invest in certain elements which we have become the leader in, because simply put, if we don't do it, someone else will. And I think it's in our interest to maintain those things, and those do require some level of conventional forces.
Great. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.